The Rhine was more than a river. It was a serpent of legend, a silver scar carved through the ancient heart of Europe, its waters flowing with the ghosts of empires and the blood of forgotten wars. For centuries it had been a boundary, a natural titan that divided lands, cultures, and destinies. But in the bitter spring of 1945, for the battle-hardened men of the US 3rd and 7th Armies, the Rhine was not a geographical feature. It was Hitler's final venomous curse, the last breath of a wounded and cornered beast. These soldiers were not the fresh-faced boys who had stormed the beaches of Normandy nearly a year before. They were veterans, forged in the crucible of hellish landscapes. They had clawed their way through the nightmarish labyrinthine hedgerows of France, each field a potential tomb. They had stood firm and bled in the frozen forests of the Ardennes during the desperate lunge of the Bulge, witnessing the dark heart of the Nazi war machine in its death throes. They had fought for every inch, every mile of blood-soaked soil from the Channel to the German border, their progress measured in the graves of their comrades. And now they stood here, on the western bank of this timeless river, their boots sinking into the mud of its shores. Before them lay the last great barrier, the final obstacle between the Allied armies and the blackened industrial heart of the Third Reich. One more step, one final monumental push, and the war could, at last, be brought to an end. But that step was not merely a physical advance, it was a descent into a meticulously prepared hell. Adolf Hitler, in his final delusional stand, had transformed the Rhine from a natural defense into a man-made fortress of terrifying proportions. His orders, issued from the crumbling bunkers of Berlin, were absolute, simple, and merciless. Burn every bridge, destroy every potential crossing point, and turn the river into a grave of steel and water for any who dared approach. The German army, no longer fighting with the disciplined arrogance of blitzkrieg, but with the frantic, cornered desperation of a nation in its death throes, obeyed. The systematic destruction of the Rhine bridges was not a tactical retreat. It was a symphony of annihilation. Each explosion was a scream of tortured metal, a funeral bell ringing for a Reich that refused to surrender with dignity. To the American soldiers watching from the relative safety of the opposite shore, the message was transmitted not in words, but in the cataclysmic fireballs and the slow, agonizing collapse of stone and steel. They saw the intent behind the destruction. This was not a withdrawal, it was a last stand, a promise of mutual destruction. Private James R. Holcomb of the 79th Infantry captured this grim realization in his diary, his words etched with a new kind of fear. We'd seen men die before, in mud and snow and sun, but this was different. The river didn't care. It was ancient, cold. It took everything we had, our fear, our courage, even our quiet prayers, and gave back only a chilling, indifferent silence. For the engineers, the men who would bear the brunt of this cursed river's wrath, the Rhine was a personal executioner. Standing knee-deep in the freezing, sucking mud of the riverbank, they saw not a strategic objective on a map, but a wide, swirling expanse of death. Every pontoon they struggled to float, every section of Bailey Bridge they dared to anchor into the treacherous current, was a potential coffin. They knew their work would be zeroed in by invisible 88mm guns hidden in the misty hills beyond, their crews waiting for the perfect moment to unleash hell. The problem they faced was as brutally simple as it was seemingly impossible. How do you move an entire army of steel, 30-ton Sherman tanks, colossal artillery pieces, and countless trucks across a wall of water guarded by an enemy you cannot see? How do you make tanks swim? How do you make artillery breathe underwater? How, in God's name, do you build a bridge faster than death can destroy it? Night after sleepless night, the front was illuminated by a grotesque ballet of light and sound. Powerful searchlights, their beams slashing impotently through the thick river fog, created shifting cages of light. Tracer rounds, brilliant and deadly, stitched the darkness like fireflies from a nightmare world. The air itself was a toxic fume, the acrid smell of cordite clinging to uniforms, skin, and the very breath the men drew into their lungs. Each explosion that blossomed on the far shore wasn't just a sound. It was a physical reminder, a tremor felt in the chest, that every second of delay, every moment of hesitation, meant more men drowning, more machines sinking to the riverbed, more bridges burning before they were even born. They were fighting an enemy, yes, but they were also fighting the elements themselves. The Rhine was not just a front line, it was nature, weaponized, cold, indifferent, and ancient in its power. And yet, on that precarious edge between solid land and the watery abyss, the Americans prepared to do the impossible. All along the western bank, artillery units dug their guns into the earth, their long barrels aimed like accusing steel fingers at the far shore. Each howitzer, each long tom, was loaded with more than just high-explosive shells. They were charged with the pent-up rage, the bone-deep exhaustion, and the unyielding determination of a long campaign. They had chased the spectre of the Reich from the beaches of France to the very gates of its empire. Now they would use these steel fists to blast the door open. Captain Robert K. Warren of the 104th Division later recalled the palpable tension, a memory seared into his senses. You could taste the river before you saw it. The wind carried the stench of oil, of smoke, and something else, something primal, fear. But we didn't come this far. We didn't lose so many, just to stop at the water's edge. By the first week of March, the tension over the entire front was a physical presence, hanging heavier than the perpetual mist that clung to the river valleys. Radio chatter was a constant, frantic hum, yet men found themselves speaking in hushed tones, as if a loud noise might trigger the apocalypse waiting across the current. Every soldier, from the greenest private to the most grizzled sergeant, knew what awaited them on the far side. Reinforced concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of machine gun fire, dense minefields, and the spectral presence of all those who had already tried to cross this river and had been swallowed by its cold, unforgiving embrace. Chapter 2. The Doctrine of the Impossible. Before the miracle at Remagen, before a single pontoon touched the water, the war had to be reimagined. The sheer brute force doctrine of speed and armoured thrust that had carried the Allies from Normandy to the German border had met its absolute geographical and tactical limit in the form of the Rhine. The river was a problem that could not be overrun. It had to be solved. In the quiet, map-strewn rooms far from the front, a new kind of planning began. This was not improvisation. It was the birth of a cold, calculated doctrine of conquest, a blueprint for hell officially designated as Operation Plunder. It was vengeance, wrapped in the sterile language of strategy, and born from the bitter lessons of every smaller river, the Maas, the Roer, that had already swallowed men and machines whole. The American way of war, which prized initiative and rapid movement, now had to evolve. Victory would no longer come from courage alone, or even from the sheer weight of armor. It would be forged in the fires of precision, logistics, and the ability to weaponize time itself. The generals, men like Bradley and Patton, stopped thinking merely as soldiers and started thinking as master engineers, as architects of a battlefield that did not yet exist. The campaign for the Rhine became a war of applied physics and overwhelming synchronized force. The first and most sacred law of this new doctrine was simple: the sky must burn. Air power was no longer a mere sword to strike at key targets. It was a hammer to reshape the entire battlefield. In the days leading up to the crossing, the fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force became instruments of utter annihilation. They scoured the eastern bank in relentless, screaming packs, turning roads, rail lines, and secondary bridges into molten scars on the landscape. German supply lines, already strained, were severed completely. Attempts to move reinforcements were dissolved into chaos and haze under the constant rain of rockets and bombs. Every roar of a P-47 Thunderbolt engine was a promise, whispered to the infantrymen below. "We are breaking their wings, so you can cross." The second law was a logistical mantra. Supply is not a function of war, it is life itself. The famed Red Ball Express, with its endless convoys roaring over dry French roads, was a memory. This was a war of floating steel and anchored hope. The humble pontoon bridge, a strange, ungainly creature of canvas, wood, and metal, was elevated to a position of supreme strategic importance. It became the vulnerable, yet vital artery of the entire advance. Each section was engineered to survive not only the immense weight of a fully loaded Sherman tank and the recoil of heavy guns, but also the concentrated fire of a desperate enemy. Engineer battalions rehearsed their movements until they became a brutal, exhausting ballet. They practiced building these bridges in the dark, in the snow, under simulated fire. Their enemy was no longer just the Wehrmacht. It was gravity, the relentless current, and the unforgiving ticking of the strategic clock. The third law declared that artillery must become thunder incarnate. Gone were the days of precise, single battery engagements. For the Rhine crossing, the entire eastern horizon would be made to erupt. The plan called for thousands of guns, 105s, 155s, 8-inch howitzers, to fire in coordinated rolling waves so dense and continuous that German forward observers would be deafened and blinded, unable to tell where one explosion ended and the next began. Each shell was designed to carry more than shredded metal. It carried an intent to crush the enemy's will, to erase the line between fear and abject surrender, to create a wall of sound and fury behind which the real work of crossing could begin. A captured German lieutenant later confessed, "It wasn't the shells that broke us. It was the silence between the barrages. Because in that silence you had time to think, to dread, to imagine the next one. You never knew when it would start again. We began to pray for the end of the noise, even if that end meant our own." As this grand, terrible design solidified in the minds of the planners, a strange and unscripted variable entered the equation. While the vast machinery of Operation Plunder was being assembled with painstaking, machine-like precision, a gift fell into the Allies' lap. At the small town of Remagen, the impossible had happened. A bridge still stood. The Ludendorff Bridge, an old iron skeleton from a previous war, scarred, cracked, and trembling in the smoke, had been spared. German demolition charges had failed to ignite completely. It was an oversight, a mistake, a relic that defied the Führer's direct orders. On March 7th, forward elements of the 9th Armored Division looked upon it with disbelief. For a young lieutenant named Karl Timmermann, that broken span was not a ruin. It was an opportunity screaming to be seized. Within minutes, he gave the order that would instantly rewrite the strategic map of Europe. Get across. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen instantly became a symbol of everything the new doctrine demanded, even though it was a gift of pure chance. It represented the ultimate adaptation, speed, and defiance in the face of the enemy's plan. It was the ultimate contrast, an ancient, crumbling structure carrying the future of warfare on its buckling back. Timmermann's men dashed across under fire, and soon the first Sherman tanks were rumbling over the groaning steel, the bridge trembling under the weight of a destiny it was never meant to bear. For 10 tense days, the bridge held, defying German bombs, artillery, and even the terrifying scream of V-2 rockets aimed directly at it. Each enemy strike only deepened its legend. The Germans poured fire into it as if punishing the structure for its betrayal. They called it the bridge that should have died. Sergeant Thomas E. Rivers, who who crossed in those first precarious hours, later recalled, "Every bolt in that bridge screamed like it was alive. You could feel the whole structure shiver when a shell hit. But it refused to fall. It was like it wanted us to win." Yet the High Command knew Remagen was a fragile miracle, a dagger point too thin to support the entire weight of the final offensive. Across the rest of the front, Patton's Third Army and other elements of Bradley's 12th Army Group would have to face the Rhine the hard way. No more miracles, no more mistakes, only steel, blood, and the ruthless execution of their new doctrine. The Germans, humiliated by their failure at Remagen, doubled down with fanatical resolve. Every remaining bridge was laced with enough explosives to vaporize it. Every inch of the eastern shoreline was turned into a deadly web of machine gun nests, mortars, and pre-sighted artillery. They were no longer defending Germany. They were defending the very concept of denial, the last illusion that the Rhine could still provide safety. And so, two visions of war collided on the banks of the ancient river. One, a dying empire, clutching at stone, memory, and a fading dream of final victory. The other, an unstoppable machine of war, powered by relentless invention, overwhelming firepower, and an indomitable human will. This was the true turning of the tide, a shift not just in the mud and blood of the battlefield, but in the mind. From this moment on, the Americans would fight not as invaders, but as the architects of their own victory. They would build their way through the enemy's final defense, one bridge, one bullet, one heartbeat at a time. As Private Harold Green of the 249th Engineer Battalion scrawled in a letter, "They told us to build faster than the enemy could destroy. I didn't understand what that meant until I saw my friends laying planks while German shells landed 5 feet away. That's when I knew our courage wasn't in fighting. It was in building while afraid." By mid-March, the doctrine was set. The Rhine would not be taken by a single heroic storm. It would be systematically dismantled by design. The enemy's last great river fortress would be transformed into a highway of American steel. The architects of plunder were ready. The Bridge of Ghosts and Miracles. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was not supposed to exist. By March 7, 1945, it was an anachronism, a relic that had defied the absolute order of a crumbling empire. It was an old iron skeleton, its framework scarred by previous battles and now shuddering under a fresh onslaught of smoke and debris. German engineers had wired it for demolition, yet when the order came to sever the Rhine, the charges fired with an incomplete, sputtering cough. They failed to collapse the bridge. It was a staggering oversight, a mechanical failure that would become a pivot of history. To the advancing men of the U.S. 9th Armored Division, it appeared as a spectral vision, a doorway that remained open into the heart of the Reich when all others had been slammed shut. The soldiers who first laid eyes on it stared in a mixture of disbelief and grim suspicion. Was it a trap? A ruse to lure them onto the structure only to blow it to pieces with them in the center? The bridge groaned and trembled, a living thing in its death throes, yet it clung to its foundations with a tenacity that felt supernatural. For the first time since reaching the river, the Rhine seemed less like an impenetrable curse and more like a silent, unexpected invitation. But the nature of that invitation was terrifyingly unclear. Did it lead to a swift victory, or to a death so profound it would swallow an entire battalion whole? Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, faced with this unimaginable opportunity, carried the weight of a monumental decision. To hesitate was to allow the Germans a final chance to correct their mistake, or to bring down overwhelming artillery fire. To advance was to gamble with the lives of every man under his command on a structure that seemed to breathe its last. His order, "Get across," was not given with bravado, but with the calculated resolve of a man who understood that fortune, in war, is a fleeting visitor that must be seized instantly. The 1st American Infantryman, their hearts hammering against their ribs, began to dash across the buckling deck. The sound of their boots on the rusted steel was a stark counterpoint to the distant thunder of war. Below them, the Rhine River, that ancient, merciless serpent, seemed to hold its breath. The current swirled in dark, ominous eddies, as if waiting for the bridge to fulfill its destined collapse. Above, the German defenders, in a state of panic and fury, unleashed everything they had. Shells from 80 Elitmemmer guns screamed in, punching holes in the deck and sending shrapnel whining through the air. Machine gun fire stitched lines of bullets across the approach roads. They fought not just to stop the Americans, but to destroy the evidence of their own catastrophic failure. They were trying to kill a bridge that had betrayed them. Sergeant Klaus Richter, a German Volksgrenadier desperately defending the eastern bank, captured the surreal nature of the fight in his journal before his capture. "We fired until our gun barrels were hot to the touch, until the air was thick with the smell of burnt powder and despair. The bridge absorbed it all, the shells, the bullets, our hatred. It was like shooting at a ghost, a phantom that refused to fall. It stood there, wounded and groaning, but it would not die." Miraculously, the bridge held, not just for an hour or a day, but for 10 critical days. It became a fragile, throbbing artery, pumping American troops, tanks, and vehicles across the last Great Barrier into Germany. Engineers worked around the clock under constant fire to shore up its damaged structure, their efforts a race against the bridge's inevitable failure. The Germans, in a final act of vengeance, even launched V2 rockets, terror weapons designed for cities, at the single span. Such was their desperation to erase their mistake. Each new explosion, each fresh scar on the ironwork, only deepened the legend of the Ludendorff Bridge. It was no longer just a tactical objective. It was a symbol of the Reich's faltering grip, a tangible crack in the wall of Nazi invincibility. For the Americans who crossed, it was an experience that bordered on the transcendent. They were no longer merely advancing, they were walking into legend, step by cautious step on a bridge that defied all logic. The knowledge that they were crossing where no enemy had set foot in living memory was both exhilarating and terrifying. They were the spearhead, and the point of that spear was balanced on a thread of rusted iron and sheer luck. Then, on March 17th, after it had served its world-altering purpose, the bridge finally gave way. With a roar that was heard for miles, a sound of tearing metal and surrendering will, the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed into the waiting Rhine. It was not a sound of defeat, but of a final, exhausted release. Its duty was done. It had held long enough. The bridge that should have died had instead given life to a new phase of the war, proving that even in the most meticulously planned destruction, there is room for chance, for error, and for miracles. The fortress of the Rhine had been breached. The wound was open, and from it, the tide of war would now pour, unstoppable, into the heart of Germany. The architects of the flood. While the world held its breath over the miracle at Remagen, a far more colossal and deliberate undertaking was taking shape along the river's length. The fragile, seized opportunity at the Ludendorff Bridge was a tactical windfall, but it could not win the war alone. The final conquest of the Rhine demanded not a miracle, but a machine built of logistics, engineering, and overwhelming synchronized force. This was the realm of the architects, the men who turned impossibility into blueprints and blueprints into reality. Their work was a testament to a new kind of warfare, where victory was measured not in yards gained by riflemen, but in tons of steel floated across a river and the precise mathematical application of fire. The first tools of this architectural marvel were the DUKWs. These ungainly amphibious trucks, nicknamed ducks, were a masterpiece of practical design. On 6 wheels, they could navigate the torn-up roads of the western bank. In the water, their propeller-driven hulls could ferry vital supplies across the Rhine's treacherous currents. They became the lifeblood of the initial bridgeheads, a floating logistics chain that refused to be broken. They carried everything from ammunition and fuel to medical supplies and rations, shuttling back and forth under fire with the dogged persistence of worker ants. Their drivers, part sailors, part truckers, navigated by instinct and courage through smoke and shell splashes. The DUKW was more than a vehicle. It was a symbol of Allied adaptability, a declaration that no natural obstacle was insurmountable. But to move an army, you needed to move its heaviest fists, the tanks and the artillery. For this, the engineers conceived their magnum opus, the floating assault bridges. Under the cover of darkness and artificial smoke screens, they would maneuver prefabricated pontoon sections into the freezing water. Each section was a puzzle piece of survival, designed to be connected under the most hellish conditions imaginable. The work was a brutal ballet of coordination and sheer physical courage. Cranes would swing sections into the current, while engineers in small boats, exposed and vulnerable, fought to secure them against the pull of the water and the hail of enemy fire. They worked with hammers and wrenches, their hands numb with cold, knowing that a single misplaced shell could turn their intricate work into a funeral pyre of splintered wood and torn steel. Sergeant Robert Green of the 299th Engineer Battalion remembered the surreal terror of these operations. We weren't infantry, we were builders. But at the Rhine, building was combat. Every bolt we tightened was a round fired back at the enemy. Every section we anchored was a piece of Germany we claimed. The fear was a constant companion, a coldness deeper than the river. But you couldn't stop. The sound of your hammer driving a pin home was the only sound that mattered. Above this Herculean effort, the sky itself was weaponized with scientific precision. The artillery preparation for the main crossings was not merely a barrage. It was a geological event. For hours on end, thousands of guns, from the mobile 105 mm howitzers of the priests to the massive 8-inch behemoths, spoke in a single, deafening voice. The doctrine was one of saturation and psychological annihilation. The shells fell in rolling waves, a calculated tempest of high explosives and steel that churned the eastern bank into a moonscape. The goal was not just to destroy fortifications, but to obliterate the enemy's will, to create a zone of such utter chaos and terror that resistance would be paralyzed before the first American boat even touched the water. A German soldier, captured after the crossing at Wesel, described the experience with a hollow-eyed stare. It was not war, it was the end of the world. The earth itself leaped and erupted. There was no pattern, no pause, only the endless crashing noise. You buried your face in the mud and prayed for it to stop, even if stopping meant you were dead. We did not see you come. We only felt the silence when your guns finally stopped, and by then, you were already among us. This was the grand, terrible symphony of the Rhine crossing. The DUKWs formed the quiet, relentless bass line. The engineers, building their bridges, were the melody, a tune of resilience and human grit played out against a backdrop of destruction. And the artillery provided the overwhelming, crushing crescendo that made the entire performance possible. It was a synergy of force and ingenuity, a demonstration that the Allies had mastered not only the art of destruction, but also the art of creation under fire. They were no longer just an army. They were a force of nature, and the Rhine, for all its legendary might, was about to be conquered by design. The thunder of crossing. The stage was set. The doctrine was written, the architects had prepared their tools, and the miracle at Remagen had proven the enemy was fallible. Now, along a broad front, the thunder of the great crossing began. This was no longer a matter of seizing a single, lucky opportunity. It was the execution of a master plan, a multi-pronged assault designed to shatter the German defenses through overwhelming, coordinated force. The Rhine was about to be stormed in a display of power that would echo through history. In the south, General George S. Patton's Third Army, ever the Maverick, moved with characteristic speed and audacity. While the world's attention was fixed on the monumental preparations elsewhere, Patton identified a vulnerable point at Oppenheim. On the night of March 22nd, under a cloak of darkness and strict radio silence, his engineers slipped into the water. There were no massive preliminary bombardments to announce their intent, only the quiet dip of paddles and the low hum of pontoon boat engines. The 11th Infantry Regiment led the way, crossing the river in a stealthy, almost ghostly operation. The German defenders, believing the wide river and strong currents made a crossing at that point unlikely, were caught completely by surprise. By the time they realized what was happening, Patton's men were already establishing a secure bridgehead. It was a masterpiece of tactical daring. True to his nature, Patton could not resist a triumphant, boastful signal to Supreme Headquarters. "I wish to report to you that the Third Army has just pissed in the Rhine, and I had every man in the army who could find a drop of water do the same." North of Patton's spectacular low-key crossing, the main event was about to begin. Operation Plunder, the set-piece battle meticulously planned by Field Marshal Montgomery, was the anvil upon which German resistance in the north would be shattered. This was the opposite of Patton's stealth. It was a sledgehammer. On the evening of March 23rd, the greatest artillery bombardment since the Great War erupted along a 20-mile front. Thousands of guns from British and American batteries fired in a relentless, earth-shaking symphony. The sky was set ablaze, the very air torn apart by the passage of countless shells. For hours, the eastern bank was pummeled into a smoking, unrecognizable wasteland. As the barrage lifted, a vast armada of assault boats, DUKWs, and landing craft surged forward into the river. The crossing was a scene of controlled chaos. Searchlights from the western bank, reflecting off low clouds, created artificial moonlight to guide the way, while smoke generators laid down a thick protective screen. The first waves of infantry huddled in their boats, the cold spray of the Rhine on their faces, watching the hellish glow of their objective grow closer. They met fierce resistance in places, but the sheer weight of the assault was irresistible. Simultaneously, the sky above filled with a new kind of hope and danger. Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history. Hundreds of transport planes and gliders delivered the American 17th and British 6th Airborne Divisions deep behind the German lines, near the town of Wesel. The paratroopers descended into a maelstrom of flak and small arms fire, their job to seize key terrain, disrupt German counterattacks, and seal the fate of the defenders. The contrast between the three crossings, the desperate miracle of Remagen, the stealthy dash at Oppenheim, and the colossal orchestrated thunder of Plunder, showcased the Allies' versatile mastery. They could adapt, improvise, and overwhelm with equal effectiveness. At Remagen, they had seized fate by the throat. At Oppenheim, they had outwitted the enemy. And in the north, they had simply bludgeoned him into submission with a display of raw, industrial-age military power. On every front, the impossible was being achieved. The great river, which Hitler had vowed would never be crossed, was now being bridged by courage, by steel, and by an inexorable will to end the war. The Rhine had fallen, the avalanche unleashed. The crossing of the Rhine was not an end, but a beginning. The trigger for an avalanche that would bury the remnants of the Third Reich. With the last great natural barrier breached, the war shifted irrevocably. The cautious, set-piece battles of the previous years gave way to a furious, rolling advance. The German army, its back finally broken at the river, began to dissolve. What followed was not merely a military campaign, but the systematic dismantling of a nation. The initial bridgeheads, won at such cost at Remagen, Oppenheim, and in the north, rapidly expanded, merging into a solid front that pressed eastward with relentless momentum. The Allies were no longer fighting their way through defensive lines. They were racing across the German countryside. The Wehrmacht, stripped of reserves and coherent command, could only offer fragmented, desperate resistance. Entire units, recognizing the futility of their situation, surrendered en masse. Columns of despondent German soldiers, their uniforms often little more than rags, trudged into captivity, their eyes vacant. The myth of Nazi invincibility was replaced by the stark reality of collapse. The first and most critical strategic prize was the Ruhr Valley, the smoking industrial heart of Germany. Here, the coal was mined and the steel was forged that had powered the Nazi war machine for 6 long years. In a classic pincer movement, the US First Army, driving from the Remagen bridgehead, linked up with the Ninth Army advancing from the north, effectively trapping over 300,000 German soldiers of Army Group B in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. The noose tightened with brutal efficiency. Inside the pocket, chaos reigned. Supplies dwindled, command structures disintegrated, and hope evaporated. Field Marshal Walter Model, a dedicated but now defeated commander, famously refused to surrender the dishonor he believed it would bring. He instead chose to dissolve his army and, days later, took his own life in a secluded forest. The surrender of the Ruhr Pocket in late April yielded a staggering number of prisoners, a force larger than that which had surrendered at Stalingrad. The industrial lungs of Germany had been stilled. Beyond the Ruhr, the advance became a triumphal and somber procession through a dying empire. Great cities like Frankfurt, Cologne, and Leipzig fell in quick succession, their names once symbols of German power, now just waypoints on the Allied dash to the Elbe River. The resistance they encountered was sporadic, often from fanatical SS units or Hitler Youth, but it was utterly futile against the tide of seasoned American divisions. The Shermans, once vulnerable in open battle, now ruled the roads, their progress limited more by traffic jams of their own making than by enemy action. For the American soldier, this period was a disorienting mix of triumph and profound unease. They were witnessing the total defeat of a formidable enemy, but they were also witnessing the utter destruction of a civilization. They marched through cities reduced to skeletal ruins, past civilians who were now little more than starving, hollow-eyed refugees. The war had created a landscape of utter desolation. Private Alan Moore of the 79th Division captured this conflicted sentiment in a letter home. "We thought we were chasing soldiers, but what we found were ghosts. Women, children, old men, all just trying to survive in the rubble. I crossed the Rhine thinking we were ending something. Now I'm not sure what we have begun." The machines of war, which had carried them so far, now seemed to feel the weariness of the long campaign. The faithful Duke KWs, their hulls scarred and engines tired, were slowly retired from the front. The roaring artillery fell silent, its work done. The war in Europe was rushing toward its inexorable conclusion. The avalanche unleashed at the Rhine was sweeping everything before it, leaving in its wake a broken nation and an enduring lesson on the wages of total war. The echoes on the eastern bank. When the last gun fell silent on May 8, 1945, the victory was absolute, yet the silence that settled over the Rhine felt heavy, filled with the echoes of all that had been lost and all that had been unleashed. The great river, once a terrifying barrier, was now just water again, its currents slowly washing away the stains of oil and blood. The bridges, both the miraculous fallen Ludendorff and the countless pontoon spans built by sheer will, had served their purpose. They had carried the Allies across, not just into Germany, but into a new and uncertain world, the shape of which was only beginning to be understood on the eastern bank. The soldiers who had crossed as architects of victory now stood as witnesses to the consequences. The intoxicating rush of the advance, the thunder of plunder, and the audacity of Patton's crossing had faded, replaced by the grim reality of a conquered land. They marched through a landscape of surreal devastation. Cities like Cologne stood as skeletal monuments, their cathedral spires rising incongruously from seas of rubble. The smell of dust, decay, and death was a constant presence. And everywhere there were people, not soldiers, but the human flotsam of the collapsed Reich, starving civilians, displaced persons from a dozen nations, and former enemy soldiers who were now just desperate, hollow-eyed men. The war had ended, but its aftermath was a vast, sprawling humanitarian crisis that now became the responsibility of the victors. For many soldiers, this was a more profound shock than combat. They had been trained to fight, to close with and destroy the enemy. They were not prepared to become administrators, policemen, and aid workers in a world turned upside down. The moral certainty of the campaign, the clear objective of cross the Rhine and defeat the Nazis, now gave way to a complex and often heartbreaking duty. They were tasked with restoring order, preventing disease, and feeding a starving population, even as they confronted the full, horrifying scope of Nazi crimes in the liberated concentration camps. The enemy had been vanquished, but the darkness it had spawned remained, a stain on the conscience of the world. The machines that had carried them to victory now seemed out of place. The Sherman tanks, parked in neat rows, gathered dust instead of mud. The roaring DUKWs were beached and silent. The engineering marvels of the pontoon bridges were dismantled, their parts shipped away, the river flowing unobstructed once more. These instruments of war had achieved their purpose, and in the new peace they were relics. The men, too, felt like relics. They longed for home, for the familiar fields and towns of America, but they were changed, carrying back with them memories that could never be shared fully or forgotten. The Rhine crossing, in retrospect, was more than the decisive military maneuver that ended the war in Europe. It was a threshold. On one side was the colossal effort of destruction, the mobilization of millions, and the application of overwhelming force to break a tyrannical regime. On the other side was the beginning of a new struggle, the struggle to build a lasting peace from the ashes, to manage the vacuum of power, and to confront the moral abyss that the war had revealed. The men who crossed the river had been forged in the furnace of total war. Now they were tasked with helping to shape a fragile peace. The river itself, the ancient, merciless serpent that had been Hitler's last curse, now flowed silently between the past and the future. It had been a barrier, then a highway, and now, finally, it was a mirror. In its reflective surface, the Allies saw the full measure of their achievement, the ingenuity, the courage, the immense sacrifice. But they also saw the reflection of the ruin they had been forced to create, a sobering reminder that the cost of crossing into victory is a burden that echoes long after the final shot is fired. They had conquered the Rhine, and in doing so, they had crossed into history, leaving behind a river that would forever bear the silent memory of their passage.